Books presents The Spiral of Life, Book 1 of the Eileen in the Otherworld series. Written by Francesca McMahon. Read for you by Rebecca Daltrey. Disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and not an accurate depiction of the modern and historic practice of paganism and its many branches. Dedication. To my Celtic ancestors, may you find peace in the other world. Chapter 1. Memories Can Hurt. The hammer came down once, twice, thrice again to flatten the smouldering metal. Eileen smiled as she pulled out the piece with her tongs and twisted it this way and that, checking for inconsistencies in the shape. She frowned when she found an imperfect line and shoved it back into the flames. When the metal turned a bright orange, she pulled it from the fire and took it to the anvil. She grabbed her hammer and slammed it into the sweltering metal in a precise rhythm. "Ease up a bit, lass," Mr. Lawton's gruff voice called from beside her. "It's a belt clasp, not your axe." Her teacher laughed as he walked away, ready to comment on another student. Eileen buried her grimace. "You wouldn't see that if he knew." Eileen continued to pound her hammer into the metal until her muscles ached. More carefully this time, like Lawton said. She relished the workout. Smithing beat the gym any day of the week. Not only did it feel great, the precision of the skill helped her focus, and Eileen needed focus. She had taken up the art nearly 2 years ago when her therapist had recommended finding an activity that required concentrating the mind and draining the body of energy. Best way to stop the fits of rage. Of course, that part went unsaid. She had stumbled on blacksmithing purely by accident. On her social media feed, she'd found an edit for the character Kate from the movie A Knight's Tale, Blacksmithing. Beyond finding her beautiful, Eileen found herself fascinated with the art after that. 2 years later, and here she was, an apprentice blacksmith at Lawton Forge, working towards her apprenticeship qualification. She had a long way to go, but one day she would be out there in the world as a real modern-day blacksmith. Hopefully. The sounds of banging, sizzling and quenching from her classmates' workbenches calmed her. She wasn't fond of being around so many people, but as she glanced around at their class of 8, working at their forges or shaping their tools on their anvils, she knew that these were her exceptions. Even if she never talked to any of them. Blacksmithing, after all, was a rather solitary experience. Your work needed your full concentration, no time to chit-chat unless you were asking to borrow some tongs or the one hot cutter Lawton had. It was because of this that the forge had become the one place where, despite everything, she could forget her past and focus on the present. Most of the time, at least. As her hammer hit against another section of metal, she could feel the intrusive memories slipping through. She brought her hammer down again, and the image of a fist against a nose flashed in her mind. Eileen tried to distract herself. She pushed the metal back into the flames. A familiar spark tickled at her fingertips. Shaking her hands, Eileen took in deep breaths. She just needed to concentrate on what she was doing, and it'd be okay. After taking out the piece, Eileen hit the smouldering metal and tried to picture anything but that image. As she twisted the piece, bending it into shape, all she could hear was crunch. Her fist breaking David's nose. Smack. A fist connecting with his jaw. Eileen shook her head and stepped away from the workstation, back to the fire pit. She pushed the metal into the flame and took a breath. Turning from the fire, she wiped a hand against her sweaty forehead. She couldn't let her mind slip back there. Eileen needed to focus on the belt clasp she was making. It was as she tried to clear her mind that she noticed the bright white sparks coming from the fire. Crap, she spat out. She pulled the sparking metal from the flames, only to find that half of the material had burned off, melting away while she was distracted. She could just about make out the lost material among the coke. There was no saving it now. Dumping out the mess onto her work table, Eileen tugged off her gloves and threw them down. That didn't go well, did it? Mr. Lawton, in his thick lilt of a Geordie accent, said, making Eileen jump. Mr. Lawton stood in front of her, eyes solely focused on her destroyed piece. She hadn't expected him to engage with her again after his last comment. He was very much a hands-off teacher. Sir, Eileen started, only stopping when he raised his hand for silence. She gulped as the scruffy man examined her piece. Mr. Lawton was a large man, a benefit of working his trade for 3 decades. He could scare anyone trying to start trouble with one look, but that gentle smile he would give his students when they did a good job made his intensity easier to be around. When he reached out and tenderly lifted her piece into the air, Eileen caught the fascination in his gaze as he focused on each part of her creation. It's crap now, but you can fix it. Lawton carefully lowered the half-constructed buckle back onto the anvil's surface. Just gotta concentrate, aye? I mean, yeah. Mr. Lawton chuckled in his deep and gruff way. Keep that fire and all, red. You need it. She nodded. Will do, Mr. Lawton. He smacked a hand on her back, and she braced herself to avoid flying into her workstation. Eileen expected him to leave after that, but he didn't. She pretended he had and went back to her buckle. Can I ask you something? He asked, his voice low, as if he didn't want the others to hear. Eileen put the hammer down. Sure. His gaze stayed on the buckle as he tilted his head. Why have you never made a weapon? Don't get me wrong, lass. It's a refreshing change of pace from all the swords and shields new students are always clamouring to make. I'm just curious. Eileen rubbed the back of her neck. Someone needs to make a belt buckle to stop the sword wearers from losing their trousers. She went back to her table of materials to avoid meeting his eyes. I'll make a fortune with buckles. Just you wait. Lawton hummed in response. Thankfully for Eileen, he didn't push it any further and took his leave. She let out a sigh of relief. Focusing on the buckle in front of her, she collected more metal to put into the flame for shaping. As she pulled the metal slab from the fire and used her hammer to flatten its edges to the shape she needed, a spiral frame, Eileen found her mind drifting back to her professor's question. How do you explain that you're afraid of hurting people so much that the idea of even making weapons terrifies you? Eileen shook her head. It was the last day at the Smiths before their time off for the weekend. At least, in theory. Mr. Lawton would often open up the shop on the weekends for the students, so Eileen would be back tomorrow, especially considering the upcoming break. A week from now, it would be half-term, and, unlike her usual term breaks, Eileen wouldn't be able to spend it at the forge. She'd be heading home, to Balloch, Scotland. Eileen wanted to finish the buckle before she left. Thinking of Balloch made Eileen nervous. She hadn't been back in 5 years, not since... The idea of seeing anyone she knew there made her feel sick. In the end, though, it would be worth it, as she'd be seeing her Nana again, or as she called her, Mamo. Eileen was making this buckle for her. The special touch, as she marked on all her creations, was the image of a spiral, an intricate curl starting from the centre of the circle that swirled until it reached the edges. Eileen had been obsessed with spirals since childhood, ever since her Mamo told her of their importance. A spiral has magical properties, Hen. Mamo would reach up to hold the spiral pendant necklace she always wore. They can represent many things, from your life cycle to the passage of time and even death. Eileen had taken in every word. She never expected that Mamo would gift her a matching spiral necklace of her own that day. As she waited for the buckle to cool, Eileen reached up to touch the necklace that still hung around her neck. She'd followed Marmot's instructions and never taken it off. Touching the carved twirl on the wooden pendant, tracing it with her fingers, always made her feel calmer. Her therapist had told her it was a coping mechanism for when she felt overwhelmed, but in reality, it just reminded her of home. Not Ballock, but the two places that always made her feel safe. Eileen could picture it easily in her mind whenever she touched the pendant. The colour-patched house she decorated with Marmot. The sound of the green leaf trees that rustled in the gale winds. She could picture the path from Marmot's house to the shores of Loch Lomond. Eileen could even smell the fresh water of the loch, which filled her senses to the point where she felt she was drowning in it. A clap of hands shocked Eileen back into the present. "All right, everyone, let's finish up quickly now." The sound of fires going out, tools slamming up on shelves, surrounded Eileen. "We ran over, so don't worry. I'll clean up for those who've got to run." Wrapping her belt buckle spiral in a heat-resistant wrap, Eileen went to leave her piece on the side alongside the others when Lawton came up to her. "I'll get that," he told her. "I'll make sure it's kept safe while you're away." Eileen frowned. "What do you—" Lawton's cuckoo clock chimed 5 p.m. Bollocks! She didn't have time to ask what he meant. With a quick, "Thanks, bye," Eileen rushed off at top speed. She was going to be late for therapy. Chapter 2. Therapy Sometimes Helps. Eileen hated group sessions. She understood their usefulness, sharing pain, seeing the progress and success of those in the group. That was all great. That is, if you believed you were capable of that progress yourself. Eileen couldn't stand talking around others. Her old solo therapist had said she was an anxious introvert who had closed off from others because of past trauma and needed to work through it to address her history. Suffice to say, she thought that her therapist was a moron. As the girls of the group engaged in conversation, discussing their past and what triggers had occurred that week, Eileen let her mind wander. She knew it was rude, but sometimes her mind just did that. A lot of emotion in one room could be overwhelming sometimes, and that feeling wasn't helped by the fact they were sitting in a close-knit circle on the cold, hard floor in the middle of a Catholic church. The group took place at the front, near the altar. Lines of wooden pews stretched out beside them, giving them an eerie feeling that, though empty, something still sat watching them. Stained glass windows left reflections of light on the floor, illuminating them in whatever colours the sun had caught. It had always been unnerving for Eileen to have the images of saints staring down at her in session. It felt like they were listening in and passing judgment on everything she said. The echo that many old buildings had only worsened that feeling of unease. Everything they said and did bounced off the walls and was thrown back, as if the church were communicating its disapproval. "Eileen!" Mrs. Desai's voice brought Eileen back from her stupor. "Do you have anything else you'd like to share today?" All eyes turned to Eileen, and she wished the ground would swallow her whole. This was the other part of group therapy that she hated, being the centre of everyone's attention. She hated being watched. Well, I made something cool at the shop today. This nice belt buckle that I'm giving my mama when I see her during my term break." Eileen stared at her fiddling fingers. "It'll be nice to see her. It's been a long time." "Are you nervous about going back home?" Her hands closed into fists and her heart beat faster. "Nope." The girl nearest to her, Emily, she thought it was, rolled her eyes at that answer. Eileen's nails dug into the skin of her palms as she tried to focus on controlling her breathing. "You can speak about how you're feeling here, Eileen," Mrs. Desai continued. "Have you felt anxious about returning?" Eileen turned away from the therapist's prying gaze to the window nearby. She couldn't see out of it, having to look at an image of Jesus and Mary instead. At least they'd only judge her silently. "A little, I guess." Eileen stared down at her closed, trembling fists. "What do you feel worried about?" Mrs. Desai asked. Eileen's knuckles were white from how hard she was clenching them. Worried about how that would be perceived, she quickly unfurled them and reached up to grab hold of her pendant. An instant sense of calm washed over her then. Her chest, which had felt tight, loosened, allowing her to breathe. The window didn't show the outside world easily, but as she stared harder, she glimpsed the trees of the nearby park. When she breathed in again, she could almost smell the spring air of newly blossoming nature rather than the musty smell of the old church. What was she worried about? That I'll see David. Eileen didn't let go of her necklace. I don't have anything else I want to see. Mrs. Desai nodded, clearly recognizing the signs not to push her any farther. Eileen was grateful. She'd never been a big sharer, even before her issues manifested. The other girls looked away, disappointed. Working with a group to them meant that everyone should engage and contribute. It's the only way to heal, they would say. Eileen would hold back a scoff whenever they mentioned it. Talking about your feelings did nothing. All it meant was that they could act like what they did was okay because they felt bad. They don't understand, her mind told her. They don't know what you are. If they did, they'd wish you weren't here too. All right, team, Mrs. Desai said, standing. Great session today, and I'll see most of you next week at the same time. Grab your forms from me at the door on your way out. Eileen slowly collected her things. She liked to wait until everyone else had left before she did. The other girls liked to chat as they left, or organise going out for tea to relax after. Eileen, on the other hand, preferred a solitary walk through the nature reserve nearby. After everyone was gone, Eileen headed to the door where Mrs. Desai stood with questionnaires. She expected 2, but was given 6. I think you gave me too many, miss. Mrs. Desai frowned. These are for when you're away, so we can track your mood. Enough for 2 weeks. No, I'm only going away for 1 week, a week from now. Has she gotten confused? Eileen wondered. I received a call from your mother earlier today explaining the situation, Mrs. Desai said. Has she not spoken with you? Eileen reached for her pocket before remembering she'd left her phone at home. She often did on days when she was doing intricate design work for class. Technology easily distracted her. Playing music or having access to the internet just kept her mind off what she was meant to be doing. Once she tried searching for a match image for the design she was working toward, and then, 4 hours later, she'd somehow ended up watching a 2-hour YouTube video examining the Andor TV show. Eileen would have to remind her mum about getting that ADHD diagnosis, and try to cut back on her media consumption in general. I'll see you. Eileen didn't know how to finish that sentence. Bye, Mrs. Desai. She rushed away from the church. It seemed today she would have to miss out on her walk. She had some questions for her parents. Chapter 3. Punch It Out. Her house wasn't far from the church. It took less than 20 minutes for her to get back most days. Fewer today, considering she was running full tilt across the open field towards her house. Usually Eileen was grateful that the house her parents had bought when they moved here had the field. The city of Carlisle wasn't as green as Balloch, the loch making the vegetation grow stronger and more vibrant, but the natural land was still a place of peace. Except for today. Today she didn't soak in the unexpectedly warm sun above, or the chirp of the birds in the trees. Today she stormed right across the field, leaped over the fence, and made her way toward the house. Compared to their house back home, on paper, the one here in Carlisle was far superior. It was large, modern-day, red-bricked terrace with a humongous garden, an insanely big garage, and 3 huge bedrooms, the third of which was used as an office. Everything about the house was perfect, but it still wasn't home. Home was a cramped 2-bed house with a tiny kitchen and a well-loved living room. Home was Eileen's height marked on the doorframe and the forts they'd made with the sofa cushions and blankets. But Balok wasn't home anymore, and that was her fault. Eileen opened the door harder than she'd intended and cringed at the slam of the handle against the nearby wall. She expected her dad to yell at her from wherever he was in the house, but nothing followed. That was when she noticed the suitcases by the kitchen's entrance. "Ma?" Eileen called out as she stepped towards the kitchen. That's where her mum would usually be found after work. "Ma, where are you?"
"Upstairs,"
a distant voice yelled. Eileen was almost to her parents' bedroom when her mum's strawberry blonde head popped out from hers.
"In here, sweetie,"
her mum said with a smile. Eileen followed, but clenched her jaw. She hated when her parents went into her room without her permission. There was a lot of private stuff in there, and she dreaded the day they'd find something by accident while snooping. "What are you?" Her question dropped off as she took in the mess her mum had made of her room. Eileen prided herself on being organised, with her bedroom especially. It was her sanctuary, her space. It was only fair that Eileen respected the one place that offered her the peace and quiet she needed. But now, all that calming energy she'd made for herself was whatever this was supposed to be. "Ma, what are you doing?" Eileen yelled. "You're going to ruin my clothes." "It's fine," her mum said with a wave of her hand towards the bed. "I'll fold them as they go in the suitcase." Eileen glanced towards her ever-made bed and saw a large suitcase and a pile of clothes atop it. On the wall by her bed was her blacksmithing shelf, which, thankfully, had not been harmed by the careless tossing of outfits. That shelf was Eileen's pride and joy, holding an array of creations she'd made throughout the years, from the terrible, unusable trowel she'd made in first year to the handmade dice and keychain. She'd even made the hooks and shelf itself by hand. Seeing that it was unharmed, as well as most of her room beyond the disaster of her wardrobe and bed, Eileen took a breath and turned back to her mum. "Why are you packing today? We don't leave for another week, right?" Her mum didn't answer. She just grabbed another pile of clothes and, thankfully, carried them to the bed this time. Eileen watched as her mum slowly began to fold and pack the items into the case. Eileen bit her tongue over the way she was folding. Now wasn't the time to be picky. She needed answers. "Why does Mrs. Desai think I won't be here next week?" Eileen asked. Once again, she was met with silence. "Ma!" Eileen stepped towards her mum. She tried not to let the hurt show when her mum flinched away from her. It's not like she could blame her. "What's going on?" "We're leaving for Balok tomorrow," a deep voice said from behind. Eileen stuffed her hands in her pockets as they tightened into familiar fists. She faced the newcomer in her bedroom doorway. She loved her dad. She did. She'd been a daddy's girl when she was young. But that was before Eileen ruined everything and made her dad give up the job he loved in Glasgow to become the local doctor in Carlisle, Cumbria. They'd only been here 5 years, and his once fair blonde hair had already dulled to grey. Since moving, their relationship hadn't ever been the same, and that was Eileen's fault too. "What?" she asked in surprise. "You heard me." Her dad's voice held no room for argument. Eileen started, confused as to what was happening. Why were they leaving tomorrow? Her half-term break wasn't for another week. That's when it hit her. "What happened?" The brief silence that followed was enough of a clue. When her mum moved around her to stand beside her dad in the doorway, a united front, Eileen knew. "Your mammo's taken a turn, Lean," her mum whispered. Her heart leaped into her throat. She knew her mammo had been sick. Their phone conversations and video calls were enough of a sign to show how quickly she was deteriorating. It felt like only yesterday they'd received the dementia diagnosis, but it had been 6 months at least. "Your pa called us this afternoon," her mum continued. "I tried to call you, but—" She gestured towards Eileen's bedside table, where her phone lay. "So I called your teacher and Mrs. Desai to let them know. I'm okay with us going earlier. I want to see Mamo and help Pa," Eileen said. clenching and unclenching her hands to fight back the electric feeling that tingled at her knuckles. But why didn't you have them tell me? I could have left class early. She gestured to the state of her room. I could have packed my own bags. We could have even left tonight. We did what we thought was best, her dad said in a tight voice. Your routine helps you. We didn't want to disturb that. But this is Mamo, Eileen snapped, unconsciously taking a step forward. Her mum half-stepped back, away from her. Eileen stopped in place. The glance between her parents was enough for the growing frustration, fear, and grief to fall away in that instant. Sorry. Eileen moved back. Sorry, I'm tired and I like my things and it's fine. I'm fine. I'm sorry. No, Eileen, it's not your fault. I'll check my bags later. She cleared her throat, trying to dislodge the pain she felt at seeing the distrust in her parents' gaze. I'm just gonna go work out for a bit. Wordlessly, Eileen picked up her phone and slipped past her dad, rushing quickly downstairs to the garage. The garage had been converted into an exercise room a year after they'd moved here. It was a sparse area, filled up by a few different machines and stations, but only 2 of them were used regularly. Only by Eileen. Her eyes focused on the black cylinder bag hanging from the roof. It was time to work out some stress. She stripped off her clothes from the day and dropped them into the laundry basket they kept by the stairs. She opened the top cabinet drawer, chose a loose threaded tank top and a pair of lycra shorts and put them on. She then grabbed up her favourite pair of gloves and opened her phone. Bluetooth connected, the robotic voice of the music speaker said, echoing around the room. Eileen focused on the bag in front of her. Play Punch It Out playlist. Playing Punch It Out playlist. The beat of the first song had Eileen bouncing. She warmed up her muscles with some quick steps around the bag as the music built up its pace. As the first song kicked fully into high gear, Eileen pushed forward, almost propelling herself toward the bag. Her gloved fist hit the soft synthetic leather with a smack. The frustrations of the week, the months, the years flowed through her. It was as if her mind was slipping away from her body as her fists smacked against the bag, once, twice, thrice, in quick succession. Never it angry, the voice of her old coach echoed in her mind, grounding her. That's how you get hurt. Eileen had taken up kickboxing when she was 14. Her parents had hated the idea, which made sense after everything that had happened, but Eileen had loved it. Just like blacksmithing, it gave her a constructive way to channel her frustration, but in a way that hurt. Eventually, her parents understood after they'd seen how much calmer she would be after a session. They even bought her first bag for the garage. Her fist slammed into the bag, hard, too angry. Pain reverberated up her arm and made her wince. Pulling away, she shrugged her shoulders and went again, landing the blow perfectly. This time in the centre of the bag. Energy surged within Eileen, like an adrenaline rush that she couldn't get enough of. That's when she knew. She had to stop. Or at least, when she should have stopped. Electricity sparked all up her arms, making her feel stronger than she ever had, and that was terrifying. The first time she'd felt that spark, she'd broken David's jaw, and then his ribs. That feeling was the sign that her anger was taking over. That feeling meant she was dangerous. Eileen didn't even know why she was so angry. She just always was. Throwing another punch, unfocused, she missed the bag and slipped, colliding with the heavy object face first. She heaved great, panting breaths as she wrapped her arms around the bag, hanging onto it for support. As she clung there, the beat of her music pounded in the background and under her feet. She could barely feel it now. The voices in her mind so much louder than the lyrics as the worst-case scenarios of returning home played in her mind, over and over again. She sniffed, her eyes watering. She wiped tears away in frustrated surprise as she slumped to her knees against the bag. I don't want to go back. Chapter 4. Family is Everything. They left for Balloch at 8 a.m. the next morning with a car full of bags and an engine full of gas. Eileen's family weren't chatty travellers. She was, thankfully, able to slip on her music and tune out everything as the world passed her by. Outside her window, the land changed around her, from the sloped green pastures of England to the stormy remains of Hadrian's Wall and, eventually, the expansive fields and hills of green that spread farther than the eye could see. Even when they passed by the city, the land never really disappeared. It only receded a little. As the world around them became more familiar, the anxiety in Eileen's stomach grew. Reaching up for her necklace, Eileen closed her eyes and took a breath. She'd be with Marmo soon. That's all that mattered. Then they pulled into the town. Balloch had changed little in the 5 years since she'd been gone. Her part of town had always looked old, but in a way that felt more homely than dated. Its white-painted, red brick houses with tile roofs stood out compared to the orange brick of Carlisle. Add in that none of them lined up symmetrically, the tall and thin right next to the stout, and it made for an interesting sight. The streets began to blend with more vegetation the closer to Loch Lomond they drove. She'd been gone so long, and yet it felt like no time had passed at all. Unfortunately, the last part couldn't have felt more real as their car slowed down to a crawl, matching the busy street speed limit. Eileen knew it wasn't possible, but she was sure the people on the street were glancing her way. Her actions had made her the talk of the town all those years ago. She'd half hoped they'd forgotten her face by now. She realised she'd been naive to think that. Eileen slid down in her seat, hiding herself from view. She stayed hidden like that until the moment they stopped. When her mum glanced at her for the first time since they left Carlisle, Eileen caught her confused expression at Eileen's scrunched position. Fell asleep, Eileen mumbled, rubbing her eyes for added effect. Eileen's mum nodded in response, though the frown on her face told Eileen that her acting skills were lacking. As they all exited the car, stretching their aching limbs, they collected their bags from the trunk and headed towards the door of the house. Despite it all, Eileen couldn't help but smile as she saw it. Unlike Balloch, her grandparents' house had changed a lot. That didn't surprise her much. It changed every year, as per Marmo's command. Last time she'd been here, the door and window panes had been painted yellow to match the summer sun. The window boxes were an array of sunset colours. Orange Mexican sunflowers and yellow, bulb-like Burberry's Darwiny were mixed with the purples of lavender and the reds of lilium. The aromas reminded Eileen of hot, sticky nights in this bungalow house during the height of the summer holidays. Eileen smiled to herself at how easily she remembered the flowers. Marmo had made it her mission to teach Eileen everything she knew about plants and had gifted her herbology and botanist books for every birthday and Christmas. The houseplants were different this time. The colours were slightly more muted, though from the empty plant pot Eileen saw tucked away behind the garden wall, it was clear it had been done recently. The door and window panes had been painted a dark, almost black green that glowed in the sunlight. In the plant pots and window fillers there were more green, some bells of Ireland, green dahlias, and a few ladies' mantle flowers. It was odd to only see plants of the same colour. Marmo couldn't stand uniformity. Everything needed its own signature and to have a role in the image of the house. To have anything one uniform colour, green, just didn't feel like something Marmo would like. She then remembered what her parents had been telling her. Marmo wasn't the same person anymore. Before her mind could run off with the thought, the front door was thrown open and the sudden image of her pa was running to greet her. Pa had aged a lot in the last 5 years. She may have seen him in video calls, but in person the greys were more prominent and the wrinkles deeper. Though that shouldn't have really surprised her. He was 80, after all. It still hurt to think about. He may have looked older, but he was still sprightly for his age, jogging quickly to Eileen's side and pulling her in for a bear hug. "Here's my girl," he whispered and held her tight. Tears pricked Eileen's eyes as she gently reciprocated the hug. It had been a long time since someone had been this unconditionally happy to see her. Pulling back, Pa smiled warmly at her, his wrinkles disappearing with it, and he suddenly seemed many years younger. "It's been too long." Pa took her suitcase from her and led her to the house. "You should come back more often than you do. Your Mamo and I have missed your visits." She knew he wasn't saying it to make her feel bad. It was just what grandparents do. That didn't stop her from feeling guilty about it as she followed Pa inside. The moment she stepped in through the door, the smell of freshly bloomed lilies and lavender filled her nose. Taking a deep breath, she inhaled the aromas of home before searching for Marmo. Her Pa caught her attention with a pat to her shoulder. He nodded towards the study. "Tea? Coffee?" he asked, guiding Mum and Dad to the kitchen with one hand and ushering Eileen away with the other. With her parents easily distracted by the promise of caffeine, Eileen snuck away to finally reconnect with her Marmo. Her steps were initially quick until she got closer to the white, flaky door that led to the study. What if she doesn't remember me? Eileen wondered, coming to a stop. They said it was bad, but what does that mean? Who will I see when I go in there? Shaking her head to clear those thoughts, Eileen took a breath and reached for the door. She pushed it open, only to hear voices inside. "Are you sure I can't change your mind on this?" said one that Eileen didn't recognize. It sounded distinctly female, though there was a gruffness to it that reminded Eileen of the voices from her dad's old war movies. She hated those films. "It's not her burden to bear," an older voice responded. This one softer than the other, though still croaky in the way age sounds. It was Marmo. "Ha, beha, ro, gurage, Morgan. I won't make it shorter." "You can't protect her forever." Eileen frowned and leaned forward, trying to see through the small open gap of the doorway, but whoever was in there wasn't in view. She could only just see Marmo sat in her armchair, staring directly at whoever she was talking to. "No," Marmo glanced away from her companion, "but I can try." Silence fell in the room and, not wanting to disturb just yet, Eileen waited a breath before she opened the door. Marmo, who had been staring in the direction of the bookshelf, turned towards Eileen, her green eyes locked with Eileen's own. They were duller than their usual brightness. She appeared lost, somehow. "Hi, Marmo," Eileen smiled as she entered the room fully. She then went to speak to Marmo's guest, only to find that no one was there. Frowning, she looked behind the door in case they were hiding for some strange reason. Where did your friend go?" Eileen scanned the room and found no sign that anyone had been here, and there was no chance they could have slipped past Eileen. Even the window behind Marmo was closed. There was no way anyone could have left between her eavesdropping and her entering. She stepped closer to Marmo to check to see if she'd managed to get a hold of a phone, but saw nothing in her possession beyond a cooled cup of tea on the chair side table. Shaking her head, she turned back to Marmo, who hadn't answered yet. When Eileen saw her, she felt her heart break. Marmo was looking around frantically, as if she were afraid.
Morgan, you shouldn't be here.
Eileen frowned.
It's Eileen, Mamo, not Morgan.
Who the hell is Morgan? A hand tugged her forward with a jerk, bringing her close to Marmo's side. She stared at the face she knew so well and saw no recognition. Even worse, she thought Eileen was someone else entirely. Someone she didn't want here.
You'll get in trouble for being here again, Marmo said, frantic. You shouldn't have come. I'm sorry.
She had to rack her brain for Marmo's real name.
Ruth, I'm sorry I came. I'll go if that's what you want.
Marmo didn't respond. Instead, she stared at her plant pots that rested on the windowsill. She appeared almost lost in thought. Eileen wondered if she often looked like this, like someone chasing after a memory that wouldn't come to them. Her hand came to rest upon her chest, reaching for something that was no longer there. "Mamo," Eileen spoke, trying to draw attention back to her. All she received in response was a heavy sigh.
"Mamo, where's your necklace?"
That gained Marmo's attention. She peered down, confused, as if she was just noticing the empty space. Then her expression became serious and intense as those familiar green, sharp eyes fell on her. She laid a hand atop Eileen's.
"Where it needs to be."
"What does that?
"Are you sure she'll be the one, Morgan?"
Marmo interrupted, her voice urgent. She shifted anxiously in her seat, as if she were afraid something terrible was about to happen. Eileen frowned. "What does that mean?"
Yes,
Eileen responded, though from the way her Marmo seemed ready to burst into tears, she wished she hadn't.
But she'll be fine. I'm sure of it."
Marmo's other hand reached out, and, for a moment, Eileen thought she was about to be slapped. Instead, Marmo's coarse, garden-worked hands pressed gently against her cheeks.
"Don't make empty promises to me, Morgan. I've always seen right through you. Walter as well."
Her thumb stroked Eileen's cheek.
"You don't need to promise me anything."
She removed her hands then and leaned away from Eileen entirely, folding back into her armchair. She stared out the window once more.
"I'll protect her,"
Marmo said, resting a hand beneath her chin to hold her head in place as she stared out into the garden.
"I always will."
Eileen ran a hand through her hair. She did not know how to deal with people who weren't well. Marmo was no exception. All Eileen could think about was who she was protecting. Did she mean me? She wondered, though she couldn't remotely understand why that would be the case. She didn't know any Morgan, and she wasn't exactly in danger of anything and in need of protection, except maybe from herself.
"Mamo, what did you mean about being the one?"
Eileen rested a hand on Marmo's knee, trying to regain her attention. She had no idea what was happening or what she was even talking about, but maybe she could help somehow.
"Mamo, who's Morgan? Could I find her for you?"
Still, nothing. Marmo seemed completely unaware of her presence now. She sat staring out the window in silence. If not for the signs of her breathing, she'd have looked as still as a painting. Eileen felt helpless seeing her this way.
"Mamo,"
Eileen whispered, trying again, desperate this time.
"Mamo, I came home. I came home for you."
Nothing. That moment of clarity was all Eileen would have. Her parents had warned her about how bad the dementia was, but Eileen hadn't believed them. Sure, she'd seen adverts for the foundation and heard their stories, but surely that couldn't happen to her Marmo. The Marmo who always had a story to tell and a sweet to give.
The Mamo who would let her help with the garden and, frequently, let her choose what colour it would be that year. Her Mamo had to be in there somewhere.
A sigh escaped Marmo's lips. Eileen waited for something more to follow.
but nothing did. Fixing her gaze to the ceiling, Eileen blinked back tears before squeezing Marmo's hands in reassurance. "Why don't I get you some of your favourite sweets?" Eileen said, standing from her crouched position on the floor. "How does that sound?"
She didn't expect an answer, but it hurt all the same not to have one. As she headed for the door, she glanced over her shoulder to her distant, dormant Marmo. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I won't leave you again." Chapter 5. The Past is a Eileen slipped out of the house without letting her parents know where she was going. She didn't want to deal with anyone right now. She made it to the shop with relative ease, using her hoodie to hide her face from the shopkeeper, just in case.
"You know you look like you're going to rob the place, right?"
a voice said from beside her. Jumping in surprise and knocking a line of sweets to the ground, Eileen met the gaze of a brown-eyed girl holding back a laugh behind her hand. She was dressed in a simple t-shirt and ripped denim jeans, and yet she still made it seem like she'd just walked off a photo shoot. Her afro curls framed her face beautifully, showing off her soft and kind smile. The girl bent down and started picking up the sweets.
"Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you."
Eileen started picking too. "It's okay. I was in my own world."
"Sounds fun."
"Oh yeah. I'm king of Camelot there, wizard's sidekick and everything." The girl laughed.
"Let me know if you're ever looking for a court jester."
Or a queen, Eileen thought, but made sure to keep to herself. She wasn't that cringy. Out loud.
"Foxes?"
the girl asked, holding the bag in her hands. Eileen nodded. "They're my Marmo's favourite. She loves the purple ones." The girl handed the bag over to her with a smile that dazzled Eileen.
"Good choice. I love the red ones, personally."
Before Eileen could even respond, the girl was out the door with a melodic laugh following her. Eileen hadn't even got her name, and yet she was sure that she'd met her future wife. Collecting the fox's sweets and a stick of pepperoni for herself, she headed up to the counter, replaying the mad meet-cute encounter in her head.
"That'll be £2.50. Do you need a bag?"
the shopkeeper asked her. "Nah, I'm good, thanks." The older man squinted at her.
"Do I know you?"
Eileen dropped her chin, not meeting his gaze, and tapped her phone on the card machine. No, you don't." She rushed out there as fast as she could. She couldn't risk someone recognizing her on her first day back in town. Most everyone knew what she'd done, and, in a town like this, the moment she was spotted, everyone would hear about it. Munching on her stick of pepperoni, Eileen headed toward the bridge to make her way back home to Marmo. Eileen had barely made it onto the bridge when trouble arrived in the form of Chloe Talbot and her gang of lackeys. Chloe had been one of the girls she'd gone to school with when the incident happened. One of the girls who had always been by David's side back then. They'd never exactly been in each other's good books before the incident. Chloe and her gang were part of the popular crowd. Eileen had been the school loner. They steered clear of each other until that day. Now Eileen was high up on Chloe's shit list. Pulling her hood lower, she went to cross the road, only to find herself stuck by the number of cars speeding by. Crap.
"Hey, is that you, Eileen?"
Chloe called out in her nasal voice. Eileen didn't respond, desperately waiting for a break in the passing of cars to make a run for it. If she pretended she couldn't hear them, maybe that would be enough for them to leave her alone. Eileen took a step to run across the street as the last car sped past, but a tight grip pulled her back. Eileen glanced up to find a lanky teenage boy with slicked back hair holding her by the arm and realised she was done for. "I think it is, Chloe," the boy sneered. He leaned forward, his breath smelling of cheap cigarettes. "David was one of my best mates. Psycho. We don't even see him anymore because of you." I think you've got the wrong person," Eileen stuttered out as she pulled herself out of his grip. "I'm just here visiting my mammo, that's all." Eileen moved away from the two of them, but found herself stuck when her back hit the wall of the bridge. She could turn and run, The other members of Chloe's gang didn't seem interested in her. She could make it. She just didn't want to risk being wrong. Nah, the boy who'd caught her, she was sure his name was Jack, said, "You're definitely her." Chloe stepped up to her, her blonde, high ponytail giving her a little height, but she was still a few inches shorter. All the same, Eileen still shrunk into herself. "Can't believe you came back," Chloe bit out. "After all you did." Eileen glanced around, hoping someone would step in. The 5 stragglers of the group were standing awkwardly to the side. 2 further ahead on the bridge tried to call Chloe away, saying it wasn't worth it. One stood closer to them and was the more vocal one of the group, and Eileen knew this girl. "Guys, this isn't cool," the girl from the shop said, glancing at Eileen briefly. "Leave her alone and let's just go."
"Jack, mate,"
another spoke up, an older boy with a barely there mustache he was clearly trying to grow out.
"We only have an hour of free time. I want to eat before going back to class. Come on, she ain't worth it."
Neither Chloe or Jack reacted to their friend's pleas. The shop girl didn't seem happy about what was happening, occasionally trying to catch an adult's attention as if she were hoping they would intervene. She seemed to forget that adults wouldn't give a damn about what kids got up to. Not their kids, not their problem. Eileen was cornered. She considered pushing Jack out of the way to run, but just as her hand twitched to do it, she tucked them into her pockets, digging the nails into the palms of her hand. She couldn't risk hurting them by accident. Chloe leaned in close, resting her hand on the bridge wall beside Eileen. She was shorter than Eileen by 5 inches, but that didn't stop her from shrinking away in response. "What are you doing back here then, We thought you were off at a loony school." Eileen dropped her gaze. "My mamma's sick. I'm just getting her something to feel better." She chanced a glance at Chloe. "I'll go and you won't see me again. Please." "David said please. You remember that?" Chloe snapped. Eileen flinched. "Didn't stop you then, did it? You just kept going." Chloe slapped her hand against the stones beside Eileen's side, making her bite her tongue to stop from reacting. "And going, and—" "Chloe, that's enough. Shut it, Freya," Chloe snapped at the shop girl. Freya, the shop girl, was staring at Eileen, concern in her gaze. She was clearly uncomfortable, but Eileen doubted she'd be able to take Chloe on. Chloe was the queen bee, and she always got what she wanted. Freya didn't stand a chance against her. "Did you enjoy it?" Chloe asked, getting in Eileen's face. A spark of electricity tingled at Eileen's fingertips. "No, please." "Do you enjoy hurting people, Eileen's heart raced, just like it had with David all those years ago. It pulsed so hard and so fast it was almost difficult to breathe. Then her vision would become blurry until all she saw was a threat. Then they would back off. Then they would leave her alone. "She thinks I enjoy being like this." "Let me go," Eileen whispered, reaching up desperately to grab onto her necklace. "Please." "You know he had nightmares for months." Eileen tried not to see Chloe's tears. "I did too. I remember the blood. I remember 4 teachers had to pull you off him. Do you remember that?" "I'm sorry." Taking a breath, she tightened her grip on her pendant. "I never meant—" Chloe yanked her hand away from the necklace, tugging the chain until it dug into the back of Eileen's neck. A spark shot down Eileen's arms. Next thing she knew, Chloe was on the floor, her blonde hair splayed out behind her. Eileen's hands were out in front of her, shaking wildly. Her hands thrummed with an electric energy. Where they had been pushed against Chloe, a warmth now flowed through her veins. Even her fingers thrummed with power, a power that should have terrified her. Except it felt good. And that was far more frightening. I'm sorry," Eileen said, panic making her voice shake. It was like her words broke them all from a spell. Chloe started crying. Her friends, except Freya, rushed to her side. None of them paid Eileen any mind. So, like any sane person would do, she ran. Eileen couldn't hear shouting or pounding feet behind her when she sprinted away. She chanced a glance over her shoulder and found the gang still on the bridge, helping the injured Chloe, all except one. Freya was still watching her. Eileen couldn't see her expression, but she was just standing there, staring, even as the rest helped a crying Chloe from the floor. It was unnerving. Eileen pushed herself faster, the charge of the energy still sparking within her, ready and waiting for her to do more. She didn't know where she was running to, but wherever it was better than here. Chapter 6. Drowning is the New Therapy. A shooting pain up her legs finally slowed Eileen's pace. She was breathing hard, sweat dripping down her back and dampening her face. She really needed to work on her stamina if she was going to be here for 2 more weeks, or maybe become a hermit and never leave the house. Both seemed like good options. Eileen was walking at her natural pace now, and when she looked up at where her feet had taken her, she still nearly stumbled. The tree line to Loch Lomond. Eileen breathed in deeply, ready to relax in the surrounding nature, but something was off. The sky above had clouded over. What should be fresh blooming trees surrounding her were wilted, the brown leaves of autumn hanging on as the branches danced in the cool wind. They danced a one-way waltz, almost as if guiding her forward. Even the wildflowers that would grow by the side of the path down to the loch were not in good shape. Only a few seemed to have made it to the spring bloom. Their colour dulled, as if tangled with the dead beside them. This wasn't the loch Eileen remembered. It was only when the trees and plants blended together, blurring so much that Eileen could barely see them, that she realised she was crying. Her body shook with tears as the electricity still fizzled within her. She ran again as she followed the path down to the water. Eileen could only hope that where she was going, there would be no one in sight. She couldn't risk being around people right now. Eileen didn't know what would happen if she was. She could still feel the weight of Chloe's body against her hands as she pushed her. Her palms felt like they were on fire, a fire that spread up her arms, across her chest, and to her heart. Eileen knew this feeling all too well, and she needed to release it. She made a turn and headed down a steep pathway to the waterside. Even 5 years on, the beach of stones and algae was the same as it always was. The powerful scent of water made Eileen feel that, despite the changes further up the shore, she was home. And, thankfully for her, the beach was empty of people. Eileen had never been more grateful for Scotland's poor weather than at this moment. Though the spreading fog across the water was new for this early in spring. Crouching down, groaning at her aching legs, Eileen pulled off her shoes and socks. She placed her phone and the sweets inside her trainers for safety, rolled up her pant legs, and speed-walked toward the water. The stones were painful against her feet, making her wince, but she kept going. She waded into the water, holding back a series of curses at the freezing temperature, until she was knee-deep and the cuffs of her rolled-up jeans were slowly soaking with water. As she took a breath, Eileen shoved her hands into the water, her jaw locked at the cold bite at her fingertips, numbing the electric feeling that still buzzed within her veins. She unclenched her jaw and let out a scream. Only when her throat felt like it was burning and about to give out did she stop. The echo of her scream surrounded her, carried on the waves of the loch and by a sudden howling wind. Her throat hurt, as did her numb fingers and toes, but the burning energy coursing through her was extinguished. Eileen stared up at the cloudy sky and let out a breath. "Why am I like this?" she thought, letting the freezing water sink into her skin. Only when she realized she was shivering from the cold did Eileen feel safe enough to leave the biting sanctuary of the loch. Once back on dry land with wet feet and legs, Eileen didn't feel like leaving. She knew she shouldn't stay out any later. Her parents would probably have noticed that she'd left by now. But still, she sat down on the beach, the stone stabbing her in the butt, and stared out over the waters. She sat there for a long while. Every time she sighed, her breath formed a trail of mist in front of her face. Eileen didn't want to go back home. She didn't want to see Marmo like that again. She couldn't stand the idea of being a stranger to her. Eileen brushed away a stray tear and stood up. But it didn't matter what she wanted. She had to go. Besides, Marmo may not remember, but Eileen did promise to give her those sweets. She was about to slip on her shoes when something strange happened. Her pendant, the spiral around her neck, grew warm. Eileen stopped what she was doing, stood upright, and reached up for the necklace. It didn't feel warm to the touch now. Thinking she was imagining things, she slipped her shoes onto her cold feet and grabbed her socks and Marmo's sweets. Heading up the bank, trying to ignore the chafe of her shoes, Eileen felt her necklace grow warm again. She stopped in place. "That's weird," she mumbled, reaching up to hold the wood once more. Eileen glanced around, trying to figure out if she was just feeling an out-of-place warm breeze. That was when she noticed it. The fog had spread. Before, it had been at a distance, only covering a few of the smaller islands on the farther side of the loch. Now it had spread to the beach, dancing over the stones and heading up the pebbled bank towards her, like it was trying to swallow her up. "What the?" Eileen started, until she was cut off by a cry. "Help!" Eileen, immediately alert, searched the beach for the voice. Nothing. "Help me! Help!" the small voice cried, followed by the sound of a frantic splashing. Eileen squinted through the fog. In the distance, about 200 yards from the shore, a pair of hands raised into the air, waving madly. The wet head of hair appeared above the water again. The hands belonged to a struggling child. "Shit!" Eileen cried, searching for someone nearby who could help. Where the hell had he even come from? "Help!" The voice cut off. Eileen whirled around, and for a horrifying second she couldn't see the kid anymore. They came splashing to the surface again, clearly panicked. She had no choice. Dumping her items and throwing off her shoes again, she charged forward. Ignoring the stinging of the stones against her feet, Eileen leaped into the water. Unlike before, she submerged herself fully into the loch. Her entire body screamed at the sharpness of the icy waters by sending a rack of shivers up and down her skin. "Christ! Balls! Fuck!" she thought as she swam through the bone-chilling cold of the loch. The kids screaming and splashing were getting closer, but so was the strength of the fog. She could barely see a foot in front of her. Eileen stopped swimming, unable to continue in fear that she could end up heading in the wrong direction. "Kid!" Eileen shuddered out through her chattering teeth. "Shout for me!" She bobbed in place, turning frantically in every direction. "Where are you?" Nothing. "Oh, God. I can't have been too late," Eileen thought. "They were shouting for me up until I stopped." Then she felt something touch her foot. Yelping in surprise, Eileen stared down at the water beneath her. She couldn't see a thing, the water too dark to see through, but she knew something had touched her. Could the kid be underneath already? Eileen threw her chin over both shoulders, hoping for a sign that she was close. Nothing happened. No call for help, no ripple in the water, nothing. "Crap!" she muttered as she looked down at her reflection in the water. "Crap!" Eileen took a deep breath, then dove. The waters of Loch Lomond had never been the clearest. While one could make out the details that were in close proximity, without proper diving equipment it didn't make much difference. But this time, it was as if Eileen had plunged into a room where all the lights had gone out. It was a terrifying feeling. She kicked her legs and searched as low and wide around as she could manage. Eileen held an arm out in the hopes of feeling anything, but eventually the need for air forced her to swim back up to the surface. Just as she took her first breath, readying to dive back down again, something grabbed her foot and held on for dear life. Eileen was so surprised she almost forgot to panic.
She swallowed a great gulp of frigid water as the kid pulled her farther under, kicking and thrashing. Eileen tried to remove their grip as best she could. She even tried to reach down and pry them off her leg. Nothing worked. Her last thought, as the distant light above her faded into darkness, cried out through the cold, "I'm not ready to die."
Chapter 7. A Whole New World, but less Jasmine. Eileen didn't remember passing out. One minute she was kicking and screaming as she drowned, the next she only saw black. She wondered if this was what death felt like. Then she vomited up water. Laying on her side, her nose and throat burning from being sick, she tried to gulp in air. She blinked her eyes rapidly to clear the tears, but her vision stayed blurry. Eileen could only just make out the green of the grass before she rolled onto her back to stave off the nausea. She stared up at the bright blue sky and wondered to herself, what the heck happened? She concentrated on her breathing until she could inhale properly again. Eileen sat up and tried to find her voice. She needed to find that kid. Once she was upright and able to look around, Eileen had to pinch herself to make sure she was still alive. Everything was bright, luscious green, so bright that it made her eyes ache, as if she just stared directly into the sun. It was like her surroundings were in a permanent state of spring bloom. Vibrant trees circled her around a clearing, each ranged in height and size. The largest was an old and vast weeping willow. Past this luscious green land, in the distance, an entire world spread farther than the eye could see, but no two of what she saw were the same. The land was a kaleidoscope of colour, blending more and more together the further into the distance she tried to see. Some parts changed from green to light brown, almost like a desert, with dunes rising so high into the air that Eileen wouldn't be surprised if they were touching the sky. There were even trees that reached so high up they disappeared among the clouds like something out of a giant's fairy tale. She'd never seen a place like this before. This isn't Balok.
"You aren't as sick as you look,"
a gruff voice said. Eileen jumped at the sudden voice, spinning around to see who was there. She found herself staring into a pair of glowing white eyes. Eileen shrieked and tried to back away, but tripped. In front of her, standing on 4 legs, was a horse, or at least what used to be a horse. Its body was covered in sickly and scaly green fur. Its mane was made of decaying seaweed dripping with water. What was more terrifying, besides everything else, were the skeletal parts of its body. Too stunned to stand, she crawled backward, her wet clothing dragging across the ground. The monster followed after her, showing off its razor-sharp teeth in a terrifying smile.
"Don't run, human,"
it said in a raspy voice that echoed, like he was speaking underwater.
"You don't want me chasing you."
It was the chilling nature of his statement that made her stop. Eileen slowly pushed herself to stand as her heart pounded in her chest. She reached up for her necklace to calm her panic, but quickly let go in surprise. Instead of the warm feeling of nature that would fill her when she touched it, the necklace shocked her with an ice-cold surface. Where am I?" Eileen demanded in a shaky voice. "What am I doing here?" Out of nowhere, a warm summer breeze brushed her skin, bringing with it a cascade of leaves that flew around her in a dance. The white-eyed monster snorted and nodded to his right. Nervous about having him out of her sight, Eileen quickly glanced to her left with the intention of turning right back. Before she could, something caught her eye. Standing beside a clear-flowing river was a woman swathed in green. She stood as tall as an oak tree, her shadow swallowing Eileen whole. Her hair was tied in a delicate French braid with multicoloured flowers sitting between each plait. The braid reached all the way down to the soft grass by her feet. The woman's skin was as green as the grass itself, if not more so.
From the tips of her toes to the crown of daisies on her head, she looked like she had stepped straight from a children's fairy tale. Even her outfit seemed ethereal. It was a gorgeously made dress of spun honey with cherry wreaths that held it all in place. As Eileen breathed in, the scent of warm spring filled her senses. She smelled the flowers of the meadows she and Marmo would play in when she was a child. She felt calmer, just as she usually did whenever she held her necklace. The woman turned and locked eyes with Eileen. They were softer, but just as commanding in their green as the horse creature's white, though, unlike the horse, they didn't have that unnatural glow. Instead, they brought a warmth that reminded Eileen of the feeling her pendant gave her. "Welcome, champion." The woman's voice was as gentle as cotton on the wind. "Welcome to our Dahi." Eileen, articulate as ever, responded by turning to vomit in a nearby patch of jasmine.
I told you humans weren't worth the trouble.
The horse-like monster snorted. "Hush, Bradine." The woman raised a hand to the beast. "The poor child must be overwhelmed. Your jibes will not help matters." Eileen wiped her mouth and turned in time to see Bradane, the talking horse, do the horse equivalent of rolling his eyes. As his white eyes rolled up to the sky in disdain, she fought the urge to throw up again. On wobbly legs, Eileen walked towards the towering woman. She made sure to give the horse creature as wide a berth as possible as she went. "Who are you?" she demanded in as firm a voice as she could muster. "And how did I get here?" An indignant huff escaped the horse beast as he focused his beady, white eyes on Eileen.
I drowned you.
That stunned her. She swallowed hard. "Does that mean I'm dead?" "Oh, my dear child, have no fear. You are alive and well yet." She lowered herself to the ground in front of Eileen. Not that that made any difference. Even sitting down, she was far taller than Eileen. She had to hold her neck at an angle to look at the woman's face. "Humans are not allowed in our world, except in certain circumstances. Your drowning was one way to draw you to us. The Kelpie's methods are..." She grimaced slightly. "Not the kindest way for one to arrive on our land. But it was where we found you." Eileen had heard stories about the Kelpies from her Marmo, creatures of death and chaos that bring nothing but terror and cruelty to those unfortunate enough to meet them. She had never thought they were real. None of it was supposed to be, nor this terrifying. Eileen had always just pictured an evil horse when her Marmo had told her the stories. When Bradane bared his teeth at her again, she found herself wishing her version had been right. "So, where am I?" Eileen kept one eye on the Kelpie. And why did you call me champion?" The Queen looked away at that, her smile and the warmth resonating around her fading. It was soon replaced with a heavy sadness that wilted the Queen's foliage into a dying brown. "In your world, this land can go by many names. The other world, Tir Nanog, Arnoon, Avalon. But the name our home truly goes by is Ar Dahi," she said, drifting off in thought as she spoke. "This is the home to gods so old that most have been forgotten. We are the Celtic gods, the Fae, and this is our realm." Eileen probably should have reacted to that. She was either talking to a god or, if this was a prank of some sort, an incredible cosplayer on stilts. But all she could think about was the TV show Merlin and the Avalon they mentioned there.
She'd caught the rerun of that show by accident one day when she was a kid and loved it ever since. Morgana, the sorceress, had been her first crush.
All right, time out. She raised her hands to make the shape of a T. You're a god or fae or whatever?
Yes, the Queen said, her voice gentle like the seeds of a dandelion clock. The land in which you stand is part of my domain, and...
Okay, you've got to be pulling some kind of ultimate LARPing experience or something, 'cause this is batshit crazy, Eileen snapped, her voice betraying the panic that was returning. What the hell is going on here, and why did you call me your champion? Am I like Arthur Pendragon or something?
Our Dahi is in trouble, Eileen, the Queen said, her voice trembling, and we need your help.